John, obviously, guidelines released on reopening. We had a bunch of questions come in unrelated to the reopening just because a lot of people signed up before the guidelines were released. I will encourage anybody tuning in now, if you do have questions about the reopening, the Q&A box is at the bottom of the screen. Definitely fire your questions away. We'd love to dive deep into that in this discussion. But John, we were talking about before we went live here, you've been doing a lot of reporting the last 24, 48 hours. Feel free to kick this off, kind of share what you're learning about the reopening, any perspectives around the community and stuff like that.
Sure. So I'll go into a little detail about what we learned, and then I'm happy to take some of the questions that were submitted in advance, which of course before the reopening announcement, and then we can take some live questions too. We learned we now have a roadmap for, quote, getting back to the office, getting back to work. I mean, a lot of us are working from home. Some people, there are plenty of businesses that are shut down completely. The hotels, stores, restaurants, many of them are shut down and are waiting to be reopened. Unfortunately, many of them don't get, so phase one starts now. Construction, manufacturing, and houses of worship are included in that, and health centers. They're starting to open up this week. Next week, we'll have lab space, offices, and some personal services, dog grooming, hair cuts, and car washes. Stores can do curbside pickup finally, but they can't reopen until phase two, except for those that are essential. And now phase two, the minimum that'll be is 3 weeks away. The governor's been pretty conservative, and even though the health metrics are looking promising, they're also not great either. So it's possible it could be longer. The interesting thing about lodging is opens up in phase two, but also in phase two, the governor's 14-day quarantine remains in effect. So if you come into the state from out of state, you're supposed to self-quarantine for 14 days, which makes it very hard for the hotel and tourism business. Also just notably, Boston is more strict. Their offices don't open up until June 1st. And I think we're going to learn more today. The mayor was quiet today, but he's going to have a press conference today to talk about how his plan differentiates from the state's plan. And in general, he's been much more conservative than the governor in terms of reopening. I think just because Boston itself is a bit of a hotspot compared to other parts of the state. There's a lot more I could say about the reopening. I will note that the story I wrote today was about how most white collar employers are not sending people back anytime soon. I've talked to a lot of companies that say, yeah, we'll send a few people back maybe by the end of June. We don't expect to get 25%. So 25% offices can open, but they cannot go beyond 25% maximum capacity at the beginning of all this. But most employers don't expect to get past 25% until the end of summer. Some are keeping people home, into the fall, maybe until the end of the year. So I'll happy to answer questions about the reopening plan. Happy to answer some questions that were submitted prior to.
Yeah, definitely. We already had one come in kind of relevant to what you were just saying. This question's about construction for individual apartment renovation projects, basically asking about construction around residential living. Do you know what phase or any information on where that might be included in the plan?
So construction for housing has been allowed all along, as the governor has considered it an essential service, but cities have been sort of taking it, on an individual basis. They could be more restrictive. Most notably, Boston has been very restrictive and is only now really reopening. So you have to go, come to the city and show you have the proper protocols in place, and you can start building. They've just sort of given the green light for residential construction. So you're seeing some of those residential projects reopen as we speak.
Sure. Maybe you talked about the employment side, but maybe talk a little bit before we get into more questions about expectations on the consumer side. So if I'm a consumer looking to go to a retail store, a restaurant, What are kind of your expectations now that the guidelines are out there around when they can reopen, but also how they can reopen? What are your expectations in terms of the speed in which you expect, even if a restaurant's at 25% capacity, do you expect all restaurants to be, at 25%? What are some of the things that you're hearing about, expectations around the
Well, what I'll say first, the 25% capacity is for offices. They haven't spelled out exactly how restaurants will work. I do think you're going to have social distancing, which means you're going to take out a lot of tables. So they'll be less crowded. And I'm sure there's some restaurants that won't be able to survive on the reduced foot traffic. I do think, I'm hopeful, but I think restaurants will reopen sometime in mid-June. Right now, they're still stuck doing takeout until phase 2 begins. Same thing with retail stores. You're going to see, if you've been to a pharmacy or a supermarket, you sort of have an idea how other stores are going to handle things in terms of flow. You might see plexiglass at the counter. You'll see warnings about wearing masks, that sort of thing. So I'm very hopeful that stores will open their doors by mid-June, but next week you can start doing remote fulfillment. One thing I have not seen really addressed is the whole the protocol or the standards for trying on clothes. It's one reason a lot of people want to buy clothes in a store as opposed to online. And I think that's going to create a bit of a quandary for retailers that I haven't seen fully addressed. And so that's something that people should sort of keep in mind, that maybe stores, I haven't seen sort of a universal rule for that. So stores might be taking different approaches.
Definitely. But from a business strategy standpoint, for business owners on here, or anything you're hearing kind of around the city, are business owners, do you know anything about them bracing for, meeting whatever the capacity restrictions are? Are they prepared to have people, more slowly return to their stores, even though they're reopened? Are you hearing anything about kind of expectations from the business owner side on what they're thinking?
I can tell you, on the small business retail side, that they're anxious to get open, that they are quite, willing to accommodate smaller crowds. There's some talk about maybe there should be appointments for some retailers, like I assume jewelers, that would make sense. I think restaurants, it's going to be a lot harder. To some extent, restaurants are ahead of the game because they're used to dealing with local health regulations in a way that retailers, a lot of other stores don't deal with. But they also have, they are all about bringing large crowds in. And that could be, that's going to be hard. So, their profit margins are thin, that they really need to have busy times at lunch and or dinner. And I don't know, even the busiest time might not be enough for them to pay the bills. So I think a lot of restaurants are trying to figure that out and do that calculus. I'm sure everyone is hopeful of reopening, but I'm sure there'll be some that will just say, we can't do it. So we've talked about this before. A lot of people are trying to renegotiate terms with their landlords. And I think given the new revenue levels, I would say that you would have a very good reason to go back to your landlord and say, listen, we agreed to X, let's go with Y. Some stores and restaurants, the leases are based somewhat on percentage of revenue. And so in that case, it already takes it into effect. But for just the straight, here's how much I'm paying for rent per month, I would highly recommend people try to negotiate a significant decline in revenue because of these new space constraints.
Definitely. No doubt. That's good advice. A couple more questions coming in just around this. We'll keep taking them as they come in. A question around colleges reopening in the fall. Have your perspectives or thoughts changed now that you have an idea of, kind of, I guess, the next 2 or 3 months in terms of reopening? Expectations change. Obviously large gatherings are canceled through Labor Day. I don't know what you would consider a college campus if it's not a kind of a large gathering in a way. So any perspective changes or anything with the new information out there?
Well, we're still, that's still a big open question. colleges I'm seeing more and more efforts to, particularly in the graduate side, to sort of branch or send people to virtual or online. But I think colleges know that people don't want to spend 60 grand for an online educational experience. So their business model really depends on them figuring this out. And it's really challenging. I mean, I think if they do reopen, you're not going to see, what I've heard is a lot, maybe these smaller seminars get moved to the big lecture halls, where, say, if you've got 15 people, you can do that in a 100-person lecture hall. Of course, what happens to those 200-person classes in the big lecture halls? And I don't think they can happen. I mean, the rules are, right now we still have to keep gatherings to limited under 10 people. By fall, I expect that number will rise, but I don't expect it to be above 200.
Gotcha.
I don't expect it to be in that level. So I think those big classes they're gonna have to figure that out. And of course, then there's the issue of dorms. People are there's a lot of issues with figuring out how to make dorms COVID proof.
Yeah, definitely. That's what I was thinking more, less in the classrooms, because I feel like you could social distance in the classrooms, but the dorm life and also social life of college, I mean, it's large gatherings,
right.
Pretty much across.
Yeah, every night. And that's going to be really restrictive, I think, at least.
Yeah, no, definitely. A question about blue collar layoffs and how that might affect non-essential businesses. This person wants to know, will small shops such as card and gift types be hit hard, or will white collar workers keep that area flowing? What are your thoughts about, kind of blue collar workers and the effect on, businesses?
Well, I mean, I guess the question I would say is, well, let's take the question about white collar workers first. The shops that rely on the office business during the day, and there are, businesses downtown Boston, they're going to be hurting this summer, because most offices are going to be pretty empty. Even if people start to trickle back, and they're certainly allowed to, that's going to be a challenge. The stores in closer to neighborhoods where people live, they'll do better for obvious reasons. Most people are still going to be working from home. The blue collar layoffs, that's a big problem, because obviously this economy what's happened here in the pandemic has really hurt blue collar workers much more so than white collar workers. Most white collar workers can work from home, and those layoffs are definitely going to trickle down to stores that depend on people spending money, discretionary income there. So yeah, I think it will be a challenge, and I think the biggest challenge will be, I'm just kind of visualizing the stores and restaurants in and around where I normally work in downtown Boston are really going to struggle.
Definitely. Let's try to go back to one or two of the questions that came in before we get any more questions about reopening. One question was about the PPP repayment guidelines that were released. I know we were just talking about this before we got on here. Could you share anything about that that might be useful in terms of someone who got PPP and what they need to know?
Well, it's pretty detailed. Everyone was waiting for the SBA to put out, because you're signing, the whole idea or the magic of the PPP program is that you're getting a loan that's going to be forgiven for the most part, if not all forgiven. And so it essentially converts to a grant. But in order to do that, you have to apply for that forgiveness. The SBA late Friday night put out the rules, and it's pretty detailed. I would have to say it would be hard to sum up on this call. I would recommend that people either go to their accountant, or if anyone wants to email me, I can send them some information about it. The big variables or the big problems with PPP that were not addressed, some people I think were hoping that maybe they could be addressed through the Treasury, but it really needs Congress to extend. There's a June 30 deadline to get these people back on payrolls. There are rules about, it has to be over an 8-week period. So there's a bill in the House that now needs Senate approval that would give a lot more leeway to those parameters so that you could get forgiven for your loan. I don't know. I'm not as familiar with the machinations of Washington. I do think there might be some changes to PPP done in Congress that might help out small businesses, because it still is, I've talked to a lot of people that have really appreciated it. For like a store or a restaurant, for example, that can't feasibly reopen until middle to end of June, it's going to be really hard to take advantage of the PPP under the way it's currently set up. So I would say, check out the guidelines on the SBA website, or, if you want, someone can email me at john.chesto@globe.com. That's jon.chesto@globe.com, and I can send some information along. Make sure you talk to your accountant or as well, or your banker. So hopefully Congress can give some more leeway for restaurants, because I don't think anyone, when they first passed it, I don't think they anticipated that people wouldn't be getting back into business until late June or mid-June, the way what's happening here in Massachusetts.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's been a fluid situation from the start. We had one other question about income and wealth inequality around Boston, around the state. Obviously, a lot of economic impact through the COVID crisis. What do you expect in terms of, does this change things? What are kind of your thoughts on the issue of, income and wealth inequality?
Well, yeah, I sort of hinted at it before. I do think that this is unfortunately affected the blue-collar workforce much more so than white-collar. And I'll also say, the businesses of hospitality, healthcare, and retail were sort of the hardest hit that we've seen. We've had more than 1 million people file for unemployment in Massachusetts since the pandemic began, and those are the 3 sectors that have really been hammered. And so I think that widens the gulf between the haves and have-nots. So wealthier people have, a lot of white-collar workers can work from home, and of course they have savings they can fall back on, or assets they can sell. And that is not the case. And also, COVID itself has affected a lot of low-wage workers more so because they're out there on the front lines, particularly the MBTA, or if a lot of people work in the hospitals or the stores that are still open. I think about the supermarket. I live near a Star Market, and I mean, you couldn't pay me to do those jobs right now. And I have nothing but respect for the people that are able to do them, but they are unfortunately more exposed to the virus than the rest of us as a result. And so that is going to widen even just people who are sidelined by the sickness. It's affecting people of lower income more than higher income.
Definitely. We have one question come in. And the way I understand the question, this person's asking about restaurants that are in areas of high foot traffic, like downtown Crossing as an example, basically restaurants that depend on kind of the lunch crowd. He's basically saying, since companies aren't bringing back employees until 25% until the fall, what do you expect out of those types of restaurants, kind of the quick service? I know Sweet Green does a lot with Uber Eats. Do you think it's going to be more of an on-demand push? Do you expect a lot of those restaurants to fold just because they can't maintain it in those areas? I imagine the rents are probably pretty high because normally those are high demand areas. What are kind of your thoughts for those particular restaurants?
I think you are going to see some close. I think that one of the most challenging dynamics right now for restaurants is the idea of a third-party delivery services. Most restaurants aren't built to handle delivery, and they participated with companies like Grubhub just for sort of marketing exposure more or service for their customers more than anything else. But now for these restaurants, it's been a lifeline in a way, because otherwise they wouldn't have any business at all. But the problem is that sometimes they take 40% of the revenue and certainly all of the profits away. So this has really been challenging for restaurants, and I think the delivery model will continue even after the restaurants reopen downtown. I think there'll be a lot of emphasis on delivery, in part because of the restrictions on how many people can go into a restaurant, and in part because the restaurant dining experience will not be the same as it once was. So restaurants and we're seeing cities try to crack down on this. Boston had a hearing on this on Friday to try to put limits on these commissions and other fees that are charged. But this is going to put a lot of pressure on restaurants right now. You're going to hear a lot about it in the weeks ahead.
Definitely. Just had another question about the colleges. The question is more about the actual programs that the colleges could offer. This question is all about how the colleges could potentially tap into alumni to offer some of the online programming and help kind of curate the student experience. And this person wants to know if there's been any reporting on, changes to online programming or anything like that.
I don't cover higher ed. I know that we have covered some of what's going on, but I think it's more been about what's happening this semester to get kids through the semester. There's definitely unhappy campers out there in terms of having to pay for, a program that's not what they signed up for. And I think you're going to see, I know colleges are working on sort of these hybrid models, and we're going to see all sorts of different approaches come the fall. But I think it's going to be very challenging for them if they can't do primarily in-person, instruction, particularly for underclassmen.
Yeah, should be interesting too as the models pivot. If there's, colleges that are considered mid-level in terms of reputation, if they excel in terms of the online offerings, if they're able to, over the medium to long term kind of.
I know, I think it's going to be something that plays out over time. Unfortunately, I think the colleges that are sort of at the lower end of that tier are really going to struggle because they're sort of built on this collegiate experience, but they don't have the reputation that can kind of carry them the way the ones with the bigger name recognition do. Yeah,
definitely. Not sure if you still have the guidelines in front of you. We had one question that I actually missed about dentist's office. Do you know where those might fall in the guidelines or if they were mentioned?
They were mentioned. I'm pretty sure it's phase 2, but let me just check to make sure because I don't want to be wrong. So yes, it's phase 2. Less urgent preventive services, procedures and care, e.g. routine dental cleanings and certain elective procedures. So phase 2, just as a reminder, is at least 3 weeks from now. So I think I haven't been to a dentist and I don't know how long. I'm anxious to go. I think we can start, what I would say is calling your dentist now and schedule, but I think they're going to start booking them, try to at least get on their radar. I think they're going to start booking them by mid-June based on that. I would, if it's 3 weeks, conservative and say maybe 4, maybe 5, but optimistically, June 8th could be the earliest.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that because you and I were talking about the 3-week approach, kind of some expectations. How do you think that will affect? So for like a business owner that's a part of phase 2 or phase 3, how do you look at this in terms of your own reopening strategy? Because it could be 3 weeks, it might be
pretty
6.
Open-ended.
Yeah,
it's funny. I just saw an email from a hotel that I won't name that said, "Come on back, we're opening June 8th." I'm like, oh, that might be a little over. That might be a little too optimistic. But I do think that of course, it all depends on what happens with the COVID-19 and the health metrics. But I do think that these gaps between the phases are designed to be short gaps between phase 1 and phase 2, slightly longer gaps between phase 2 and phase 3, and then a much longer gap between phase 3 and phase 4. The party line from the governor's office is it's at least 3 weeks between the phases. But I think if you're in phase 3, and unfortunately for people who like to go to the gym, gyms are in there, as are casinos, museums, and bars. The bars being places that primarily serve alcohol, not food and alcohol. They're in phase 3, and that is a big uncertainty. So I would say if you're in phase 2, you're more likely, I would say, plan on a June opening at some point, probably as soon as June 8th, but more June 15th or a little bit later. Phase 3 is going to be challenging. In phase 4, nightclubs, the sports venues, the ones where you have thousands of people gathering, or even hundreds of people gathering, that's further out. I would be surprised if they open this summer. I really would.
Definitely. One more question I want to ask you before we wrap it up is, Boston is a little bit behind the rest of the state. As a business owner, and obviously we're talking to, at least a dozen every day through the Slack community, what is there benefit as a business owner to be a little bit behind? Definitely if you're eager to open, I'm sure it's frustrating, but in terms of evaluating the protocol and the do's and don'ts and kind of, seeing how
I
people are
can
flowing.
address that for office workers. I think the office employers I talked to yesterday, that none of them said they wanted to go back first. They all said we want to see how things work. But all their employees are working from home, or for the most part, and they're able to continue business fairly regular. The revenue is not getting hammered as a result. But for businesses whose it's life or death for that business, I think most of them are eager to get reopened. Now it's interesting, in Maine, there are some businesses that are worried that maybe the Maine governor's opening things too quickly. And we may see a little of that here. But I think the businesses that are shut down completely are just eager to show that they can reopen and do so safely. So I don't know if some restaurants in particular, I think they're not going to rush into it, but I think they want to have the leeway or latitude of deciding whether to wait or whether to get going. Some restaurants will wait, but I don't know if it's necessarily an advantage to be sort of behind the others. I do think that you'll see some who will just wait to see how things play out.
Yeah, it seems like all of this is just 50-50. There's a side to each part of it, it seems like. Any last thoughts? Want to drop your email one more time in case people have more questions or want to get in contact with you? The floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm sorry we're running out of time, and there were some great questions that were sent our way that I couldn't get to. And it looks like there's some questions on the call that I couldn't get to. So feel free to email me, and I'll try to get back. I've obviously been pretty busy, but I'd like to hear from you. My email is jon.chesto@globe.com. Like I said, if you're concerned about PPP, it's pretty easy to find resources online, but I'd be happy to direct you to a few of them that I think are pretty good. So hopefully everyone's staying safe and surviving this crazy time. Look forward to talking more about this strange transition next Tuesday.
Yeah, definitely. This is week 4 or 5 for us. So
yeah, it might be on 5, I think.
Yeah, no, the attendance has been great. So just wanted to say thanks to everybody who, if you're a regular or your first time, John and I always enjoy it and appreciate all the questions. And in terms of the Slack community, the small business community, if you're not aware of what that is, a follow-up email will be sent to you for signing up to this with more information. So don't worry about that. And then, we'll be back next week, Tuesday, 10 a.m.
Look forward to it. See you then.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.